Get the microphone so people can hear me. Good evening, everyone. Hi, welcome to this special meeting of the Town of Abington Planning Board. And welcome to everybody who's on Zoom. 6 o'clock, I'm going to call this meeting to order. First thing I'd like to do is have a moment of silence for a great public servant in the town of Abington, Kathy Creighton, who passed a week or so ago. Kathy was on the Conservation Commission here in Abington for a long time. I also served with her on the Community Preservation Act Committee. Kathy was an engineer, a licensed site professional, a fierce advocate for the environment in the town of Abington, and just a brilliant person. And I'm glad I got to know her, and everyone who got to know her. We valued our friendship and our knowing her, and we miss her. So if we could just have a moment of silence for Kathy, please. All right, everyone, thank you. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize a couple of people in the audience. Senator Keating is here. Wave to everybody. And our chairman emeritus, Mr. Wayne Smith, is here tonight. And Wayne, welcome. Appreciate it. He was the chair a long time. I succeeded him as chair, and I value your guidance and support over the years, and we all do, and we miss you. But we're glad you're here tonight. So, with that, this MBTA 3A Communities Informational Meeting, I'm going to turn this over to the town planner, Liz Shea, and the assistant town planner, Kevin Kogan. Thank you, guys.
I'm going to turn it over to Kevin first.
So, as you can see on the slides here, we're going to be going over the MBTA 3A Communities Multifamily Overlay District. Next slide.
Doesn't want to do it.
Kick it.
All this practice.
Oh. As you can see on the image here, in the blue, these are all the MBTA communities in Massachusetts. An MBTA community.
Sorry.
Okay. This is our presentation overview. This is how we're going to proceed here. I'll go over exactly what an MBTA community is and why the zoning is necessary. And next slide. An MBTA community, so MBTA communities law, as you probably know by now, some of you, is zoning act enacted by the state to encourage multifamily housing within MBTA communities. An MBTA community, for those who don't know, is defined as one of the 65 communities that host an MBTA stop in a butter of those 65, meaning one of those communities next to one of those 65, or any community added to the MBTA under General Law, Chapter 161A, Section 6, or in accordance with any special law relative to the area constituting that authority. Multifamily housing is allowed by right with no restrictions in these communities. And the average minimum allowable density is 15 units per acre. 50 acres or 1.5% of the total developmental area in any municipality. For commuter rail or rapid transit communities, a percentage of the district must fall into the station area. A station area is half-mile radius around stations. And Abington is a commuter rail community. And why is this zoning exactly needed? Massachusetts is experiencing a severe housing shortage, which is affecting many communities in the state, including Abington. Compliance of the zoning is extremely important so that Abington won't lose funding for key state programs. How many times have you heard, I can't find an apartment, We would like to downsize, but we can't find a place. So the penalties for noncompliance are actually pretty severe and pretty costly. So if you don't comply with the act, then you're going to see us withholding state money for any number of programs that you're used to receiving for. That includes for schools, it includes for roads and bridges, it includes for a whole host of things that are important to communities, and that is a direct quote from Governor Healy. Some of the programs listed on this PowerPoint that are pretty relevant to this area include Mass Works Infrastructure Program, which includes like funds for public infrastructure, the Housing Choice Initiative, which includes initiatives for like expanding housing, and a really important grant that Liz Shea and I are working on called the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Grant, and any variety of future grants for economic revitalization in Abington Center. And then I'm just going to go over some Abington housing data that I picked up through Mass Housing Partnership. So I found that about 289 new units were permitted and built between 2010 to 2020, a significant decrease from 1,072 new units permitted from 2000 to 2010, and about 64% of all housing units are single-family detached. And this decrease, and there's a decrease in housing unit production from 2010 to 2020, and as I explained before, that MBTA communities could increase housing production. Hanson housing data, next slide, is an abutted community. Kind of a similar story in Hanson, 271 new units between 2010 to 2020 compared to 355 units 2000 to 2010. 81% are single-family homes, and since 2012, there's been a decrease in public school enrollment. And next slide. Massachusetts' core competitive advantage is its highly skilled workforce, and high housing costs will make it harder for us to attract and retain talent in the workforce. This weakens our economy and our employers and hurts our long-term growth and prosperity. Those cities that permitted at least 6 units per 1,000 all saw population gains from domestic migration. So that on the graph on this slide includes cities like Austin, Texas, Nashville, Tennessee, Raleigh. In contrast, though, Boston metro area saw a net loss of population from domestic migration, like Portland, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, et cetera.
So I guess it's my turn now. What are the benefits to multifamily housing near public transit? So as you can see from this slide, it provides more housing options for all. Empty nesters can downsize. There becomes a greater housing affordability for everybody. Young couples can become homeowners. College kids can come home and rent their first apartment in town. And it lowers our carbon footprint because multi-unit dwellings go up instead of out. And we're trying to create more walkable communities with this type of housing as well. These types of multi-unit dwellings are also more eco-friendly. I think all of you know from what we're seeing with climate change and the amount of increased impervious surface, that on the left-hand side, one 9-unit building near public transit is better for the environment overall than 9 single-family houses with driveways or driveways that hold 2 vehicles. You also got that heat watch report we did this summer that shows that we're getting warmer, not cooler. And what does multifamily housing look like? So this is kind of what it looks like: townhouses, courtyard buildings, duplexes, you guys know, condos, multifamilies. But what does this mean for Abington? So Abington, like other Massachusetts communities, is being required under 3A to zone for this house, under the law, to zone an area that multi-unit dwellings are allowed by right. A major goal of that law is to create more housing opportunities in Abington, particularly within the half mile of the commuter rail stop. Under the law, the town would be required to adopt this by right multifamily zoning in one or more districts consisting of a minimum of 50 acres with a minimum unit capacity of 1,022 units. A portion of this district must also be within a half mile of the commuter rail. By right, multifamily zoning allows for more housing closer to Abington, local businesses, schools, and restaurants, better accesses to workplaces, and an increase in mobility, and reduced reliance on vehicles. So this is what it looks like. The board voted to create their zoning overlay district in this area. To the left, you can see Spencer's Pizza outlined in red. To the right is that red circle is Target, and everything in green is the area the board has determined will be in the multi-unit family overlay district. So you can see the Grove is on here too, up to the upper left, and it shows a close proximity to Abington News and Spencer's and Stop and Shop as well. What 3A does not require us to do, which I think is also important to note, it does not require that we build the housing of 1,022 units. They determined that was the number for Abington, but it does not require us to build all of those units. It does not compel communities to pay for infrastructure for future development. It does supersede wetlands protection. It does not, I'm sorry, supersede wetlands protection or Title V of the Environmental Code. It does not supersede historic districts. And it does allow municipalities to get a waiver or exemption, does not allow us to get a waiver from the requirements. I think I told you guys early on in this that I was trying to see if we could locate it down by the airbase, where it's all just open land right now, and no matter how close we are down there, we weren't close enough. And there's no waivers or anything else, so. So these are just the citations where we got this information. I want to thank Kevin for pulling it all together. And then, if you don't mind, I would really like to let Judy Barrett come in. Hold, please. Hold, please.
Do you want me to try to test again?
No, you're good.
You're good.
Perfect.
You're all set. You're all set.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yay! So I can't really see people. They're all very small on my screen, and I'm sure I'm huge. So I'm going to just try to introduce you to the zoning bylaw.
Recording in progress.
I'm going to try to introduce you to the zoning bylaw that's been prepared to help you implement the MBTA communities law within the district that Liz showed on the map. And I believe you all have a copy of the zoning. I suppose, do you all have a copy?
Yep.
Okay. So it's pretty straightforward. Like any other zoning district, of course, this is an overlay, which means it lays on top of existing zoning. That doesn't go away. It doesn't change the existing zoning. It's simply, I guess the best way to think about it is it supplements what's there within the area that is covered by the overlay. So you would always have a purpose statement for a district, and there's a purpose statement here, which clings pretty closely to the purposes of the MBTA communities law. There's a provision for actually establishing the district, which will be a function of a map. Basically, it's an amendment to the zoning map, showing the area that is within the MBTA overlay. That map plus the zoning will need to be on file with the town clerk before the board has a formal public hearing. So before we get to that point, you're going to want to make sure that town council has reviewed this so we can make any changes if she wants them.
Ask a question.
Pardon me?
Wait, I'll wait.
The applicability section, which is, so this is 17540A of your zoning bylaw. When you get to C, that is the applicability section, and that kind of explains how this works. Essentially, it says you can develop under the rules of this overlay, and if you do, you have to follow all of the rules of the overlay. If you don't want to use the overlay, you can continue to develop under the rules of the underlying district. And the overlay doesn't affect you. Makes it clear that if multifamily development is happening in this district, that it's subject to 17540A and not an existing provision in your bylaw that also deals with multifamily housing. You need to separate them out because there are aspects of section 17532 that would not comply with the MBTA communities law. So just forget that entirely, and everything that happens in this district under the overlay will be subject to this zoning. There are very simple use regulations. It's single family dwelling you could continue to do. Multifamily housing, and bear in mind, a lot of communities define multifamily housing as a structure with 3 or more units. But the fact is that the Zoning Act actually says something a little bit more. And so the definition in the Zoning Act is what we have to work with because the law is subject to the Zoning Act. And that definition for multifamily housing is it's a structure with 3 or more units, or it could be 2 or more structures on a lot together, each of which has 2 or more units. So the law recognizes both a single structure with multiple units or more than one structure with multiple units. That is the definition of multifamily for purposes of this law. The other things that were suggested in here are home occupations or accessory residential uses. There's some concern. I should probably just step back a little bit and explain to you. Not everybody agrees about the best way to implement this law. So, as you probably are aware, within the last few years, the legislature has tried to make it easier for towns to adopt multifamily housing or mixed-use development by changing the quantum of vote that's required at town meeting. So the intent of the MBTA community zoning is to let you take this to town meeting and secure passage on a simple majority vote. If your town council is concerned that adding anything else may throw you to 2/3 vote, then we will just take out anything that's not multifamily housing. I think that's the best way to think about it. I've had different town councils, kind of different view on this. We just go with whatever your town council says, and that's totally fine. But so the use regulations are simple. There's not a lot of stuff in here. It's really intended to promote multifamily housing. The dimensional regulations are important. The regulations proposed are based on how Old Colony Planning Council modeled your district. And we checked that modeling. So understand that when the legislature passed this law, they passed a very broad umbrella. And they left it to the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities to figure out how to make this all work. Part of what the Housing and Livable Communities Agency came up with was a computer model that allows an analyst to look at a set of parcels and decide if you put all those parcels in a district, what would you get based on various assumptions. So in order to get you to the number of units that you need, but not dramatically more. The minimum lot area that's proposed is 30,000 square feet, with a maximum lot coverage for a project of 50%, a maximum stories of 3, 75 feet of frontage. Some of this I think is really pretty consistent with your existing zoning. Front side setbacks of 10, 10, and 20, and then a maximum number of units per acre of 18. People often say, well, the law says we have to have at least 15. Why is it 18? The reason is that when you actually model these parcels, you lose some land. The way the model is designed, land that really could not be built on is deducted. So a right-of-way, which would be part of the definition of a district, you lose that. If there's any wetlands, that gets deducted. There are things that just come out. So you never really end up with the perfect 15 units an acre. And in fact, the agency has advised all of us that are doing this work to at least do 16 or 17. Well, the way the model was done for Abington, it's 18 units an acre. There is a provision here for affordable housing. You probably know that the law does not require affordable housing. It does allow you to require it up to 10% of the total number of units in a project. And on this point, I just need to be kind of clear. They really mean 10%. They don't mean 11, they don't mean 13, they don't mean 15, they mean 10. So when you have a project that has to comply with your affordable housing section, you need to make sure that it doesn't trigger on, for anything smaller than a 10-unit project, and that you, if you have a fraction, which often happens, you're rounding down. So you're never putting the applicant in a position where they are trying to create more than 10%. And the agency's been really clear about this. So that's how this section is written. There are, following that, a series of site development standards to try to give you and the applicants a sense of how to do a quality development here. So, you know, the provisions of your existing parking are kind of okay, except you need to limit the number of parking spaces to 1.5 spaces per dwelling unit. The model is designed to penalize communities for requiring what HLC considers excess parking. So it's 1.5 spaces per unit. For the most part, I think your existing parking section is probably okay. We did provide, however, in this draft, some things to think about, kind of calling for. You want to sort of specify what you're looking for in terms of sidewalks. You want screening for parking. If it's going to be surface parking, you need to think about how you screen that from a sidewalk so people just aren't looking at banks of cars. You need to have a way to kind of minimize how much impervious surface is on the site. The parking materials are specified in this bylaw. If you can avoid having parking in front of a building, it's a good idea. I think it's kind of hard sometimes on these sites to require that. But clearly, the ideal arrangement of the housing is to be facing the street, perhaps separated from the street by a sidewalk and some landscaping, and have the parking in the rear. So that is what is meant by subordinating parking to the building. You can have, of course, garages. You can have parking under a building, but at grade. You can have a parking structure, but again, you don't want the entrance to that parking directly on the street, you know, facing people who are walking by. And then sort of minimizing curb cuts. If you have a site with a lot of frontage, it would be ideal to organize the curb cuts so you don't have multiple curb cuts too close together. There are landscaping provisions in here, some lighting provisions, some standards for buildings and how they should be oriented on the site, a requirement for some shared outdoor space so we don't end up with projects that just cover a site and don't really provide for amenities for people who live there. And of course, compliance with stormwater management and so forth. The development plan approval process in here is pretty straightforward. It really kind of follows your existing site plan bylaw with a few exceptions. We do provide for the board to specifically adopt rules and regulations to implement this new section of the bylaw, which may need, some changes to your site plan regs, I don't know, but just the authorities here in case you need to do that. And then a section on what happens if a developer needs to come back to change the original site plan. It kind of lays out here, well, it could be a minor change, but if it's not, then basically you're starting site plan review all over again. And then there's a provision for, if you want to, you can adopt some design guidelines. Of course, they have to be consistent with the zoning bylaw. I think what Housing and Livable Communities wants to make sure of is that communities aren't adopting design guidelines outside the zoning bylaw that end up imposing additional requirements that could constrain development. So you're going to need to treat those design guidelines as advisory. Developers often, because developers want to get a yes, they will typically look at your design guidelines for some guidance. They may also be helpful to you, but you're not required to adopt them unless you choose. So that's really the structure of the proposed bylaw. There are some definition amendments at the end just to help implement the affordable housing section, but it's pretty straightforward. So if I can hear you, I'll answer any questions that you have.
Okay, I'm going to throw this open for board questions. I think, Rick, you had a question to lead off, please?
Do you feel it's better to have this as an overlay district or as a completely new zoning district?
Well, you ask a good question. Most of the communities we're working with are doing this as an overlay. I think because it's generally a little easier to sell, existing property owners feel a little bit less threatened. If they are comfortable with the existing zoning, then they don't feel like the rules are being changed on them. I will say a couple of the communities we're working with are doing it as a new district for a variety of reasons that I don't think really pertain to Abington, but it's really a local call. I just think the overlays tend to be easier to sell.
Okay. Did you review our map itself, the lots we've identified?
I haven't looked at it in a while, but yes, I did look at it.
And it contains enough, even when you take away the MBTA parking lot, take away the MBTA rail infrastructure, the access road, wetlands, everything, there's still enough acreage?
So, to the best of our knowledge, what Old Colony Planning Council modeled will meet the requirements of the law.
Okay.
And Rick, just so you know,
Yep.
I have sent that in for early compliance. Gonna have to mute myself.
Not creepy at all.
And I just heard back from them, they're just looking for the shape files, which I sent to them today, so I'm hoping that we have an answer
Okay.
sooner rather than later, which it complies.
Do we want to tie any of the details in the language to whatever's recommended in the regulations, knowing that some of these regulations could change? Like a next governor could choose to change the density requirement or change the affordable housing percentage requirement. Is it worth, do we need to specify exact numbers or just, numbers as required by state guidelines?
I think you're fine the way it is now. The fact is, if HLC changes the guidelines again,
Yeah,
which of course you know is going to happen if it's done already.
yeah,
If they did, then I think you get to choose what to amend your zoning or not. The density is part of statute. The 50 units an acre minimum would have to change by legislature.
is that part of the statute or was that part of the regulations? I didn't think there
50
was.
units an acre is part of the statute.
Okay,
The zoning capacity number, the sort of total number of units that your district has to be sized for,
yeah,
that's in the guidelines.
okay. All right.
It's pretty confusing, I know.
Nope, that's it for now. I have other comments about our presentation, but I'll hold those for later.
At this point, anyone who's on Zoom with us, if they'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand. Raise your hand. Virtual hand.
Mr. Riley.
I'd like to recognize Attorney Riley, please. Attorney Riley, what's your question, please?
Thank you, Chairman Hughes, and thank you, Mr. Barrett. It's very informative. Just a quick question, and you kind of alluded to it earlier, but just so I understand it. This MBTA overlay district would allow for a density of 15 units per acre, or perhaps 18 units per
It's
acre.
18, yeah.
Right. But if I had a project and I just didn't want to build to that density, but I'm in this overlay, I can still proceed with my 4 units per acre or whatever it is I wanted to do. Is that right?
Yeah, you're not bound to build 18 units an acre. You are allowed to.
I guess, so what it's really saying is if I wanted to submit a plan with up to 18 units per acre, the planning board would be hard pressed to stop it unless there were other constraints, like not enough parking or wetlands regulations, things like that.
Yeah, they would have to approve it, with conditions.
If I could satisfy the remaining parts of the bylaw.
Yes.
Okay. We have a lot to learn, but thank you.
No, I understand, and things have been changing with this. It's just been an evolving situation for all of us who are doing this work. So I appreciate your questions.
Thank you, Attorney Riley. Does anyone else at Zoom care to ask a question, please? Please raise your hand. Okay. All right. At this point, we have State Senator Keating here. I'd like to ask him to come up and perhaps give your take on this, please, if you would. Thank you. Yes, right.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to be here and to observe what's going on here in the town. And I want to commend you for undertaking the effort that you have with the seriousness that you have. We are facing in the Commonwealth a pretty significant housing shortage. By some estimates, up to about 200,000 units are needed over the course of about the next 10 years. And one of the ways that the Commonwealth looked to promote more housing was to pass this MBTA Communities Act. You've talked about the number of housing units that would be permitted, meaning allowed under this zoning, not necessarily those that must be built. And I think that's an important distinction, and I think Attorney Riley had brought that up, that somebody doesn't have to build to this density. They can build something less, but the district has to be created to allow the 15 per acre, or in this case, because of wetlands and rights-of-way, perhaps is 18 units per acre. I guess one of the things that I'd offer is if there's any questions, although you seem to be in pretty good shape on this, or any way that my office can be of assistance as you go through this planning. If you are dealing with a state agency, for instance, and you are finding that they're not as responsive as you would like them to be, please let our office know, and we will do whatever we can to make sure that that contact is made and that the information you're seeking is provided to you in as timely manner as possible. And secondly, there is this endeavor here with the MBTA Communities Act, pretty substantial, a big change, kind of a watershed, considered by many to be a watershed relative to zoning here in Massachusetts. But I would also suggest that to be mindful of other zoning changes that may come along and look at the big picture as much as possible. For instance, in the governor's housing bond bill, she has proposed accessory dwelling units as of right in communities. And what that means is that somebody can build an accessory dwelling unit separate from their existing dwelling, connected in some way so that there's access and so forth. And it can be up to half the size of the gross square footage of the existing dwelling, or not to exceed 900 square feet, whichever is the smaller of the two. And so that is a pretty significant change as well for communities. Now, that's not law yet. That's been proposed. It may be tweaked. It may be changed in some way as it makes its way through the legislative process, but that is what's being proposed. And in a town like Abington, that could have be something significant in terms of generating housing. And that should be looked at, I would suggest, in the context of also the MBTA Communities Act, because you've got a couple things now going on that are very different than what's been permitted in the past. MBTA communities, up to 18 dwelling units per acre, and then in other areas of the town, you may find yourself with people coming in, should the ADUs become law, seeking permits to build an accessory dwelling unit that could be as much as 900 square feet, which is quite substantial. And that raises issues relative to parking, and there are some restrictions as of how you can do it. It would be as of right, meaning again that somebody could just come in and seek a permit. There are some funds that would be available in certain instances under the ADUs. One instance would be if somebody has a family member that's blind or with a severe disability, there would be some loans and grants available for that, and the governor is proposing to have about $60 million available to homeowners that are seeking to build ADUs in those circumstances. And then there are other programs that address not only ADUs, but modular housing, manufactured housing, which probably won't be as big of an issue here in Abington, but nonetheless, a part of the Commonwealth's effort to provide more housing. So I just bring that up so that to have you keep an eye on what's going on. There's a lot of discussion at the state level about housing, the need for it. There has been some, and I would describe it as nothing more than quiet talk among some about changing 40B projects, increasing that threshold from 10% perhaps to 15%. That's something that there's been some small discussions on. Hasn't really taken root yet, but it's something that I've heard at the State House, people looking at that. So a lot of things going on, and I think the effort that you've undertaken here relative to the MBTA Communities Act is the type of effort that every community should undertake to try to be thoughtful as possible, as thorough as possible, and to minimize the impacts of this legislation, but also to enhance the positives that come out of it. One of the things that I hear uniformly, and it was touched on by Kevin, is that people say, where am I going to live? Where are my children going to live? And interesting, in the data that was presented, it showed number of building permits per 1,000 people, I think it was, in various cities across the country. I think third on the chart that you showed was Nashville, Tennessee. Now, my middle son, during COVID, his company went fully remote. Their lease expired. They went fully remote. My son didn't want to work from our basement. I don't know why. The food was pretty good upstairs, but he didn't want to work from the basement. His thought was, I'm going to get down there, it's dark. When I'm done, I'm going to come up, it's dark. And at that point, the YMCA was closed. And so he looked at moving elsewhere. And he thought of moving from our home to somewhere in Boston, but the costs were really high. So he looked at a couple cities, Denver, Nashville, Austin, Texas, and he decided on Nashville. And he went to Nashville, and he now lives in the 16th floor of a brand new building. It's a co-living space. My nephew now lives with him. His view is of downtown Nashville. The workout facility is really quite nice. On the 7th floor outside is a pool deck with a great built-in pool and entertainment areas, and the view of the skyline and sunsets is spectacular. He has the ability to use shared workspace that's on the lower levels of the apartment building where he lives. If he had a car, parking is pretty affordable. I don't know what that is, but he doesn't have a car, but when he signed the lease, it would have been included. It comes fully furnished with some pots, some pans, oven, stove, TV, couch, beds, and he's paying about $1,600 per month. And so that's what Boston and Massachusetts is up against. Young people who grew up here, who want to stay here, but find that the cost of housing is prohibitive. This morning, actually at lunchtime, I was over at Bridgewater State University, meeting with some students and faculty, and one of the issues they brought up was that they are losing students to other schools for a few reasons. One, public higher education institutions, although there's been progress made, are still kind of lacking in terms of financial aid for students. And so they're supporting the Cherish Act, which would make higher education much, much more affordable. And one of the challenges that the faculty has, and they know that students have as well, is the cost of housing. And they talk about students working 2 and 3 jobs while going to school in order to afford what they have to pay to its tuition, and also to afford what they have to pay whether they're renting an apartment or contributing at home. And so we invest all this money in these young people in K through 12 through our public education system. We want to keep them here to stay in our higher education institutions, and we've invested all of that money And because of the cost of housing, they graduate and look elsewhere. They find it really hard to find housing while also meeting their student loan obligations. And their earnings just can't provide for both. So we've made all those investments. It's critical that we keep them here. Massachusetts' greatest resource is the education of its young people. We don't, and somebody said this to me today, and it kind of made sense. He said, we don't have oil, we don't have iron ore, we don't have a lot of minerals, we don't have a lot of those things that other places rely on or benefit from. But the person said what we do have is a great public education system, both K through 12 and higher education. And we should do everything we can to keep that resource, the product of those resources here in Massachusetts. And it just made a lot of sense. So the need for housing is enormous. It's so critical to our economy, so critical to keeping talent here. And every community is going to have to play a role. And that's the MBTA Communities Act and some other housing initiatives that are going to come along. And I think it's really important that you consider all of them and keep doing the great work that you're doing, being thoughtful and thorough and open and engaged with the public. And again, any way that my office can be helpful, happy to do it.
And Liz will get your contact information. And-
Yes.
And we can put that up. I really, I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
No, that's quite all right.
But thank you for, can I ask the board members, do you have any questions of Senator Keating at all?
So one of the issues that at least I've had with this is that I fear it doesn't recognize the challenge of a town like Abington meeting this versus the challenge of a city like Quincy, Arlington, Cambridge. And I know the numbers that they have to meet are just phenomenally higher. However, the underlying infrastructure that's already in place and has been in place for 100 years, MWRA water, MWRA sewer, sidewalks, roadways, all this stuff is kind of in place already. And then you come down to an Abington, a Rockland, a Hanover, and you're asking them to absorb 750 to 1,000 units without that supporting help for infrastructure. So let's say the town of Abington opens its arms, we want to do this, this is great, we're going to build 1,000 new units. We don't necessarily have the funds to then also upgrade the streetscapes, the sidewalks, the intersections, the water systems, all these other pieces. Is the state going to be chipping in to help towns who do this right, do the right thing, then also afford to absorb the development?
Yes, so under the MBTA Communities Act, it does not require a community to provide the infrastructure for development. A developer will come in, they'll seek a permit as of right to build X number of units. There's no obligation for the town to provide that infrastructure. But if the goal is to produce more housing, then the infrastructure has to be there. And so a couple things. One, by participating in the program, meaning not trying to get yourself exempt like Milton is trying to do. We'll see where all that ends up. It does keep you eligible for Mass Works grants. And then also, there was a Housing Works grant program that was established, still to be determined exactly how that's going to work. But it goes exactly to your question. Where's the infrastructure going to come from? If you're going to have, I think it's 1,022 units that could be built, again, could be, not that will be, but could be built. Let's just say that there was a plan to do 1,022. Where are you going to get the water and the sewer infrastructure for that, the road network, improvements to the local road network to support that development? It would keep you eligible for Mass Work grants by participating in this. And then there's also the Housing Works grant program that is designed to do the same type of thing to help with the infrastructure to support this. How it all works in details, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But there was some consideration given. Many legislators, myself included, conveyed to the governor that our communities are interested in doing more housing, but they just don't have the infrastructure. And I think that applies pretty much to all of my communities, all the communities that I represent, except perhaps Quincy and Braintree. All the communities in Hanover and Holbrook, Abington and Rockland, they're all struggling with the same issues. Water, sewer, or septic, depending on the communities, the particular community. Those are real challenges. And on the issue of septic, there was some funding that was put in place when we did the tax package back in the fall that does provide septic tax credits for people who have septic, provides tax credits for them when they're, when there's new construction or they are upgrading their septic systems. And so some of those things have been considered, but I would suggest not enough if we're really intent on solving the housing crisis.
I think the concern is that a lot of those Mass Works programs, iCubed, whatever, PWED grants, so many of them are tied to economic development projects, not housing. I think housing was specifically excluded from a lot of them. And I'm hoping that when you take up the housing bill, maybe that's something that can be tweaked, is to start to open up those grant programs to some of these programs.
Yes,
I think
exactly
iCubed
that.
is sitting on something like 300 million in funding because there's not enough developments going in for economic development.
Right.
So, you know, if we can start to tap into that and, you know, build a sidewalk down the length of Summer Street or fix the intersections, it makes it a little bit easier to accept. And people aren't going to always accept it easily, but if there's a way to say the state's going to help us absorb this, it becomes a lot easier to sell.
The iCube, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought of that. In my district, there's not a whole lot of economic, commercial, retail type development occurring. Lab space now has kind of calmed down as well. So there's not a lot of that going on. So the idea of that pool of money, iCube, perhaps being shifted, that's a great idea. I'll definitely check into it.
Okay.
Any other questions?
We actually have one question
Yes, please.
from Town of Abington Building Department, I believe.
Oh.
See if I can unmute her. So, Marion, are you there? We can hear you, Marion.
Oh, hi, great. Hi, Judy.
Hi.
My name is Marion Wong Ryan. I'm the zoning enforcement agent for the town of Abington.
Oh, hi.
I do have one question as it pertains to the adopting of the Chapter 48, the definition of multifamily. So
Yeah.
understanding it's three or more, and it's 3 or more units in a single structure, or 2 or more in 2 structures on one lot.
That's
And
correct.
currently, the zoning bylaws that under 175-14, a single structure per lot is what is permissible unless one seeks a variance. Am I to understand that in the 175-40 zoning district, it will now be allowed to have 2
Yep.
separate? Okay.
Yeah, and
right.
if you need
Okay.
that clarified, we can add that to the draft. But yes, multiple structures on a single lot would be permitted.
Okay, and so with it being 2 structures with 2 units each, it will still be considered multi, even
Yes.
though
Yes.
2-family is still considered residential. Okay, all
Right.
right, great. Thank you
I-
for the clarification.
I totally understand your question.
Yes.
I get it. But you know, Liz, I think she raises a good point that we probably should make it clear in this draft that multiple buildings on a single lot are allowed. As long as they meet the coverage and all the other requirements, they should be fine.
Right, I don't know whether or not there will be separate setbacks for each structure on the lot.
You would have a
So that's
separation.
another-
We'll
Right.
add a minimum separation between buildings. And
Right.
frankly, I often leave that to the fire chief. But we
Yeah.
can have a
Right.
specific setback. We can do that.
Right, Sean, you agree?
For once, yes.
Hey, this is good.
No,
I suggest everyone mark the date and time that Sean and I agreed.
under 175-32 of our current bylaw, when you do
Yeah.
have a condominium or apartment complex, that allows for multiple buildings on a lot, as it
Okay.
is. And I think, Judy, you're right. Most of the time, when we have had previous site plans with multiple condominium or apartment buildings, we've gone to the fire chief and said, what would you like us to maintain? 20 feet, 40 feet?
Yeah.
Three sides of access. So
Yep.
every piece of property is unique, so you kind of have to address it uniquely.
That's why I really prefer to just defer it to the fire chief, because I think we can get overly prescriptive in some of this zoning and end up creating more problems than it's worth.
Yeah,
Agree.
I agree with that because sometimes, because if you do state a minimum and you, for whatever reason, the site can't make that work, now you need a variance.
That's right.
And
I get it.
instead-
Correct.
Instead of just getting agreement from the fire chief and then the
Yep.
approval of the planning board. you're good to go. But I do have another question
All
if
right.
Marion doesn't have any follow-up.
Nope, I'm good with that. Thank you.
Okay, if you don't mind, Liz or Mr. Chairman. And I guess this is to Judy, and it kind of goes back to what Senator Keenan was saying also. The whole issue about how the town cannot be forced to invest in infrastructure to support this new proposal, which I think is great. But can the town approve a proposal on the condition that the developer pay for the infrastructure, whether that be extending or enlarging a water main for 1,000 feet, or putting in traffic lights, or widening a road, or whatever the case may be? Can
In
that
order
be?
to- Sure.
So that, all right, good. So the planning board can make that a condition so that whatever negative impacts are going to be borne by the developer and not the town or the neighbor.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty standard in site plan review anyway, so. I mean, I can take another look at your site plan bylaw, but I'm not aware of any reason the board could not do that. I mean, they're allowed to impose reasonable conditions to protect health, safety, and welfare, et cetera. So, yeah, it's definitely not the town's responsibility, but I don't know why the board couldn't approve a site plan conditional too.
Okay, well, that's, I think, good news for a lot of people, well, many people. And I think it certainly makes sense, and I agree, it does, that's what the planning board has done in the past and should do. I just want to make sure that this state edict is not now tying their hands.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't see anything in your existing site plan bylaw that would lead me to want to make changes to it here. That has not been the case in some of the other communities I work in. But it seemed to me as though your site plan bylaw is pretty fine to be able to administer this, including to address the issue you raise.
Thank you.
All right, any other questions at all?
That's only one of my long-term concerns is how reasonable conditions is defined
Okay.
as this evolves.
All right. Well, you know, on behalf of the board, Ms. Wong, thanks for very much for your question. Attorney Riley, Judy, I hope we see you at the Citizens Planner Training Collaborative event in March. I know you've always been a great supporter of that. I'm on the board of that, and I'll be
You must
there.
know I'm already doing like you said.
Okay, good. Well, you know, I'm just reminding you of that for Elaine, you know, and Ralph, but, no, I know. I've gone to every one of them there, and I think you have probably over the years too. I had nothing better to do than to go out to Holy Cross in March.
It's fun. It's a lot
Yeah, it
of fun.
is. I've already arranged to take time off from my part-time job to go out and do that this year. So, it being around 7 o'clock, I'd like to thank everyone for your
I
participation.
have more questions.
Oh, sure, okay, sorry.
This is informational for me too.
Yeah.
In our presentation, I had a couple questions.
Yep.
And frankly, I think this is some stuff that helps just provide additional context for people who are going to be looking at this later. Penalties for non-compliance. Have we received any of these grants that are highlighted here?
We currently have a municipal vulnerability preparedness grant that we're working on. MVP 2.0, it's a pilot program.
Yep.
We will be applying for the Massachusetts Downtown Initiative Grant, and I believe we have received a Mass Works Infrastructure Grant. I'd have to double check with John Stone, but I'm pretty sure he's got money from there. And we have received Real Estate Services Technical Assistance.
I wonder if it'd be helpful to spell out, like, no, Abington has already received this amount of
I
money.
actually do have a list. I started that at the beginning of this process a year ago.
On the next one, the Abington housing data, this is a really fascinating chart, because as much as people think we've grown in the past few years, it's nothing compared to what happened back at the turn of the century.
Correct.
And I kind of wonder, like, if it would be helpful to remind people, like, which projects these included, because the idea that you were approving 100 units a year is pretty remarkable. I
From
mean,
2010 to,
yeah, so like, for instance,
2000
I
and-
imagine 2002 is the Woodlands, and then Van is in here, and then what other subdivisions to remind people, oh, hey, you wouldn't have a house in Abington if it wasn't for, you know,
oh, dude, I could go way
Morehouse.
back in the time machine on that.
yeah. So, I mean, I kind of wonder if it'd be worthwhile including what some of these projects were that kind of bump these numbers up so much, just to give people, remind them of how our past housing policies allow them to live in this town currently.
All right.
Hanson housing data, do you say it's in a budding town?
Yeah, it's not.
Yeah.
It's
It's
a nearby
another
town.
MBTA community that we
Yeah.
used.
It's kind of like us.
Yeah. One suggestion is just to reduce the scale of the chart to match what Abington's is, because if you look at it quickly, it's like, oh, they built way more housing than Abington has, but in reality, they built way less. You know, Hanson's, I think, is an example of a town that's done nothing to help with the housing issue. So I don't know if there's a way to adjust that chart so that it's on the same,
I can do that.
same point. And then my one issue with some of the benefits of multifamily housing and the type of housing is more eco-friendly. My role as an elected official is not to necessarily cheerlead all the initiatives. I think we do a disservice if we don't acknowledge there are obstacles and challenges with this, especially if this is something that we're expected to stand behind, the 5 of us who are elected on this board. I feel like it would be more fair to at least acknowledge, or at least have a slide that say, here are the obstacles, or here are the challenges. And it's traffic, existing traffic. It's water, it's school crowding, it's lack of sidewalks and infrastructure. And just say, at least we've taken this into consideration. Again, I don't feel like we're necessarily waving pom-poms for some of the housing groups that come through here and say everything is wonderful and this is a lovely law. I think this is a challenge for a lot of towns to adopt, frankly. I think when the state initially did some of its regs, it also put out what 15 acres looks, or 15 units per acre looked like. And they gave different types of housing samples. Does this ring a bell in terms of like, it's from the early, yeah, okay.
No, I don't remember.
I've
been at this a long time now, so I don't remember
I
that
thought I
slide.
remembered seeing something like that, Liz.
Yeah, I'll see if I can dig it out, but as much as I love the missing middle housing because it's very true. But this also shows that when people think 15 units per housing, they're thinking, you know, high rise, and it's not necessarily. It's, you know, I spent 20 years living in Quincy Point, and it's 15 acres down there, and it's a lovely neighborhood, and I'd recommend it for everybody at some point. You know, it's dense, but it's not overwhelming. And I'd love to be able to show some of those examples, I think, of what 15 units really can look like. So I'll send that to you. On this map, did the red ovals mark anything, or is it just a general location?
No, it was Spencer's.
Yeah.
And then
No, is that the real shape of the?
Abington News is that other smaller one, straight across from
Okay.
the, where it dumps onto
The
Central
whole
Street.
rationale is I wanted to show where like, the closest restaurant was.
Oh, okay.
The closest shopping center was.
Nope, that makes sense. Okay, that makes sense. I just want to make sure I was reading it right.
Yeah.
Okay, that was it, just wanted to clarify.
Anything else, Rick?
No, thank you.
You good? Okay. All right. Okay. And we can wrap this up?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, very good. Well, again, I'm glad we gave Rick a chance to ask, Mr. Collins, a chance to ask some more questions. But again, I'd like to thank Liz and Kevin, our new Assistant Town Planner, for putting this presentation together. I'd like to thank Senator Keating for being very impromptu, being invited to participate in our discussion, and you gave us some really good information. I'd like to thank Mr. Collins for asking some really good questions. I'd like to thank Ms. Wong, Attorney Riley, and this will be on YouTube, so you'll have a chance to see this presentation again. I know, I think, again, putting in a word, I mentioned earlier that Judy is going to participate at the Citizens Planner Training Collaborative event out in Holy Cross out in March, and I think we're going to have a session on this, so it might be worth exploring. If you just Google Citizens Planner Training Collaborative, you can see if that, it's pretty cheap to attend, and it would be worth attending to get some general information on planning as well as this subject. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for attending either in person or virtually. And again, Chairman Emeritus Smith, thanks so much for coming out. Appreciate that. And with that, I think we'll wrap this up. Good night, everyone, and thank
You have
you.
a motion to adjourn, my friend?
Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Thank you.
Second?
Second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.